Tonight, one institution watches, not an army, not a government, not a court, because the Inquisition does not need permission to investigate, judge, or destroy. Across the Imperium, governors rule worlds, priests preach the Emperor's word, and armies fight humanity's enemies. But none of them are beyond suspicion. The Inquisition. The Emperor's hidden hand, an organization with the authority to question anyone, command almost any force, and condemn an entire planet if a single Inquisitor believes it has fallen too far. They were created to hunt the enemies humanity could not see. Daemons hiding behind familiar faces. Alien influence buried inside trusted institutions. Heresy growing beneath loyal cities. The Inquisition protects the Imperium from all of them, but it does so through fear. Because when an Inquisitor arrives on your world, innocence may not be enough to save you. And one person's judgment can decide whether billions live or die. Nobody is above suspicion. Nobody is beyond investigation. Nobody. Not the planetary governor in his palace, not the space marine in his fortress monastery, not the cardinal in his cathedral, not the fabricator general in his forge, is exempt from the attention of the beings whose authority exceeds every other authority the Imperium contains. The Inquisition, the Emperor's left hand, the secret police of a civilization that spans 1,000,000 worlds and that maintains its coherence through the twin mechanisms of faith and fear. The Inquisition provides the fear, not the distant, abstract fear that the galaxy's external threats generate. The orcs, the tyrannids, the necrons, the forces of chaos whose assault on the Imperium's borders produces the existential dread the populations carry. The immediate personal, this could happen to you fear that an institution with unlimited authority and no external oversight generates in every being whose existence falls within the institution's scope. The scope is everything. The Inquisition's authority encompasses every human being in the Imperium. Every world, every institution, every military force, every civilian population, every space marine chapter, every Imperial Guard regiment, every Mechanicus forge world, every ecclesiarchal diocese. The Inquisition answers to no one except the Emperor, and the Emperor does not speak, and the not speaking has produced the condition the Inquisition has inhabited for 10,000 years. An institution with the authority of God and the oversight of none. An Inquisitor can condemn a world. The statement is not metaphorical. An Inquisitor whose investigation has determined that a world is beyond saving, that the corruption the investigation has revealed exceeds what the remediation's methods can address, can order the exterminatus. The destruction of the world's entire biosphere. The killing of every living thing the world's surface contains. The reduction of a habitable planet to a lifeless rock, conducted through the orbital bombardment that the Imperial Navy's vessels deliver at the Inquisitor's command. The Inquisitor can do this alone, not through a committee's deliberation, not through a governance council's approval, not through any of the institutional mechanisms that civilizations use to constrain the exercise of the destructive power the institutions contain. An Inquisitor whose judgment determines the exterminatus is warranted can order the exterminatus, and the ordering produces the execution, and the execution produces the world's death. The power is checked only by other Inquisitors. An Inquisitor who orders an exterminatus without justification, whose judgment the other Inquisitors assess as excessive, whose decision the other Inquisitors evaluate as unwarranted, faces the censure the other Inquisitors' assessment produces. The censure can range from the political to the terminal. The checking is internal. The Inquisition polices itself. No external institution, not the High Lords of Terror, not the Adeptus Custodes, not the Lord Regent Gilliman, possesses the formal authority to constrain an individual inquisitor's actions. The Inquisition's independence is the institution's founding principle and the institution's most dangerous quality, because the independence that permits the effective prosecution of the Inquisition's mission is the independence that permits the abuse the effective prosecution's methods can produce. This is the Inquisition, the most powerful institution in the Imperium of man, the most feared force in a galaxy whose forces include the Chaos Gods and the Tyrannid Hive fleets and the Necron dynasties, the institution whose authority exceeds every other's, and whose accountability is limited to the institution's own assessment of the accountability's adequacy. The Inquisition was born from the Horus heresy, and the heresy's lessons are embedded in the institution's purpose. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest human confidant, the Regent of Terror, the being whose final acts during the heresy produced both the Grey Knights and the Inquisition, gathered the individuals whose qualities the Inquisition's founding required. Malcador identified 12 beings, 8 space marines and 4 mortals, whose loyalty to the Emperor was absolute, and whose capabilities encompassed the investigation, the judgment, and the enforcement the Inquisition's purpose demanded. The 8 Marines became the founding Grand Masters of the Grey Knights, the Inquisition's military arm, the Daemon hunting chapter, whose purpose the Inquisition's founding established alongside the Inquisition itself. The 4 mortals became the founding Inquisitors, the individuals whose authority and whose mission defined the institution the 4 were creating. The Inquisition's founding purpose was the protection of humanity from the threats the heresy had revealed. Not the military threats. The Space Marine legions and the Imperial army addressed the military. The hidden threats. The corruption that had consumed half the legions. The demonic influence that had produced the corruption. The xenos manipulation that the heresy's aftermath would reveal. The internal treason that the Imperium's own governance could produce. The hidden threats required hidden hunters. The Inquisition was designed from its founding to operate in the shadows, to investigate without announcement, to judge without appeal, to enforce without the institutional constraints that the Imperium's public governance maintained. The Inquisition's effectiveness depended on the secrecy the effectiveness required, and the secrecy's maintenance was the founding's most significant organizational decision. The inquisitorial rosette is the Inquisitor's badge of authority, the small ornate device carried by every Inquisitor, presented to the beings whose cooperation the Inquisitor's investigation requires, is the most powerful object in the Imperium below the Golden Throne. The rosette's presentation is the declaration, "I am an Inquisitor. My authority exceeds yours. My investigation supersedes your governance. My judgment overrides your laws. Cooperate, or the cooperation's absence will be addressed through the methods my authority permits." The rosette produces compliance. The governor who sees the rosette complies. The military commander who sees the rosette complies. The Space Marine chapter master who sees the rosette complies, reluctantly with the institutional pride the compliance's implications wound, but complies. Because the alternative to compliance is the opposition to the Emperor's authority the Inquisitor carries, and the opposition is heresy, and heresy's consequences exceed what the non-compliance's pride is worth. The rosette has been abused. The statement is not an accusation, it is the historical record's confirmation. Inquisitors whose judgment has been corrupted, whose sanity has been compromised, whose interpretation of the authority the rosette represents has exceeded the authority's intended scope, have used the rosette to compel compliance with directives the Emperor's purpose would not endorse. The abuse is the independence's cost, the price the Imperium pays for an institution whose effectiveness depends on the independence the abuse exploits. The Inquisition's three major ordos are the institution's organizational structure, and the structure reveals the institution's priorities through the structure's evolution. The Ordo Malleus is the oldest. The Daemon Hunters, the Inquisitors whose purpose is the detection and elimination of the warp's influence within the Imperium, are the Inquisition's original focus. The Ordo Malleus was established alongside the Inquisition itself, the Daemon hunting mission the Founding's primary purpose, and the Grey Knight's creation the Founding's primary military investment. The Ordo Malleus investigates demonic activity. The Inquisitors of the Malleus, the beings whose training has prepared them for the detection of the warp's influence in the Imperium's populations. Institutions and territories conduct the investigations that the demonic threat's identification requires. A Malleus Inquisitor who identifies a demonic incursion coordinates the response, the Grey Knight's deployment, the population's quarantine, the exterminatus if the incursion exceeds what the deployment can address. The Malleus Inquisitors carry the knowledge that would drive most mortals mad. The operational intelligence about daemons, the true names, the banishment rituals, the weaknesses and the capabilities of the warp's entities, is the knowledge the Malleus Inquisitors maintain alongside the Grey Knight's own archives. The knowledge's psychic taint is managed through the Inquisitor's training and through the mental discipline the training provides. But the management is not elimination, and the Malleus Inquisitor's prolonged exposure to the demonic knowledge produces the risks the exposure's nature implies. Some Malleus Inquisitors fall, the corruption that the knowledge carries, the warp's influence embedded in the information the investigation requires, reaches the Inquisitors whose mental defenses the exposure has degraded. The fallen Malleus Inquisitor is among the Imperium's most dangerous threats, because the fallen Inquisitor carries both the authority the rosette provides and the demonic knowledge the corruption has redirected from the Imperium's defense to the Imperium's destruction. The Ordo Xenos was established in the 32nd millennium, following the War of the Beast. The near destruction of Terra by the Orc warlord known as the Beast demonstrated that the xenos threat required the dedicated institutional response the Inquisition structure had not previously provided. The Ordo Xenos, the Alien Hunters, was created to investigate, assess, and eliminate the threats the galaxy's non-human species posed to the Imperium's survival. The Death Watch is the Ordo Xenos's chamber militant, the Space Marine formation whose members are drawn from chapters across the Imperium, seconded to the Death Watch's service for the duration the service requires. The Death Watch provides the Ordo Xenos with the military capability the Xenos threat's elimination demands. The kill teams whose composition is tailored to the threats the kill teams are deployed to address. The Ordo Xenos's scope is vast. The galaxy contains thousands of xenos species, the Orcs, the Tyranids, the Aeldari, the Tau, the Necrons, the minor species whose civilizations the Imperium's expansion has encountered and whose threats the Imperium's governance must assess. The Xenos Inquisitors investigate the Xenos civilization's activities, evaluate the threats the activities produce, and coordinate the responses the evaluations prescribe. The Xenos Inquisitor's relationship with xenos knowledge is the Ordo's most controversial institutional quality. An Inquisitor whose investigation of a xenos species requires the Inquisitor's understanding of the species' technology, culture, and capabilities is an Inquisitor who must engage with xenos knowledge to the depth the investigation demands. The engagement produces the familiarity. The familiarity produces the appreciation. The appreciation produces the risk. The risk that the Inquisitor's engagement with the xenos knowledge will transform the Inquisitor's assessment of the xenos from the hostile to the sympathetic. The sympathetic assessment is heresy. The Imperium's institutional position, the position the Imperial Creed prescribes and that the Imperium's governance enforces, is that all xenos are threats. The Xenos Inquisitor whose investigation has produced the appreciation the investigation's depth required is the Inquisitor whose appreciation the institution's doctrine condemns. The tension between the investigation's demands and the doctrine's prescriptions is the Ordo Xenos's defining institutional conflict. The Ordo Hereticus was established in the 36th millennium following the Age of Apostasy. The Reign of Blood, Goj Vandire's tyranny, the institutional corruption that produced the tyranny, the violence the tyranny's prosecution demanded, demonstrated that the Imperium's own governance could produce threats exceeding the external threats the other Ordos addressed. The Ordo Hereticus, the witch hunters, was created to investigate the internal threats the Imperium's own institutions and populations produced. The Adepta Sororitas is the Ordo Hereticus's chamber militant, the Sisters of Battle, the Ecclesiarchy's warrior women whose faith and whose military capability provide the Ordo Hereticus with the force the internal threat's elimination requires. The partnership between the Ordo Hereticus and the Adepta Sororitas is the Imperium's closest institutional relationship and the relationship whose tension the partnership's dual loyalties produce. The Ordo Hereticus investigates heresy. The term's scope is vast. Heresy encompasses the worship of chaos, the practice of unsanctioned sorcery, the maintenance of cults whose teachings contradict the Imperial Creed, the governance of populations whose loyalty the investigation's findings question, the behavior of individuals whose actions the Inquisitor's assessment classifies as threatening to the Imperium's integrity. The Hereticus Inquisitors are the Imperium's internal police at the institutional level, not the Arbites. The Adeptus Arbites enforce the Imperium's laws on the population. The Hereticus Inquisitors enforce the Imperium's orthodoxy on the institutions, the Ecclesiarchy, the Administratum, the military, the governance structures whose loyalty the Imperium's continued functioning depends on, and whose loyalty the heresy's lessons have demonstrated cannot be assumed. The Hereticus Inquisitors are feared by the Imperium's own institutions more than by the Imperium's enemies. The governor whose governance the Hereticus Inquisitor investigates fears the investigation more than the governor fears the orcs beyond the world's borders, because the orcs' threat is external, and the Inquisitor's threat is internal, and the internal threat's proximity exceeds the external threats by the margin the Inquisitor's physical presence on the governor's world provides. The three major Ordos are not the Inquisition's entirety. The minor Ordos, the Ordo Sicarius, the Ordo Sepulturum, the Ordo Kronos, and dozens of others, provide the specialized investigation the major Ordos's broader mandates do not accommodate. Membership in an Ordo is not mandatory. Some Inquisitors operate without Ordo affiliation, the independent investigators whose purposes do not align with any Ordo's mandate. and whose investigations cross the boundaries the Ordos mandates establish. The unaffiliated Inquisitor is the Inquisition's most free and most isolated member. The being whose independence exceeds even the Inquisition's already extraordinary standard, and whose isolation is the independence's consequence. The Inquisition's organizational structure is the absence of organizational structure. The statement captures the institution's most significant quality, the deliberate founding principle mandated refusal to establish the hierarchy that conventional institutions maintain. The Inquisition has no commander. The Inquisition has no chain of command. The Inquisition has no institutional governance above the individual Inquisitor's authority and the informal mechanisms the Inquisitor's relationships produce. An Inquisitor is answerable to no one except the Emperor. The formal statement of the Inquisitor's authority is the formal statement of the Inquisitor's independence, the being whose authority is derived from the Emperor's, and whose accountability is directed toward the Emperor's. The Emperor does not provide the accountability. The Emperor does not speak. The accountability is directed toward a being who cannot exercise it, and the direction's impossibility is the Inquisitor's operational condition. The condition is both the Inquisition's greatest strength and its most dangerous vulnerability. The strength is the freedom. The Inquisitor, who is answerable to no one, can investigate anything, pursue any lead, follow any evidence to any conclusion the evidence supports, without the institutional constraints that might prevent the investigation's completion. The vulnerability is the same freedom. The Inquisitor, who is answerable to no one, can pursue any agenda, follow any obsession, reach any conclusion the Inquisitor's biases support, without the institutional checks that might prevent the pursuit's worst outcomes. The Inquisition is the Imperium's most effective institution. The Inquisition is also the Imperium's most dangerous institution. The two assessments are the same assessment expressed through different evaluative criteria, and the criteria's difference is the Inquisition's defining characteristic. An Inquisitor is not born. An Inquisitor is made through a process that exceeds the Imperium's standard institutional training in every dimension the process encompasses. The making begins with the identification. An existing Inquisitor, a being whose own career has produced the experience the identification requires, selects an individual whose qualities the Inquisitor assesses as suitable for the Inquisition's purpose. The selection criteria are not standardized. The Inquisition does not maintain a recruitment program the way the Space Marine chapters maintain their recruitment, or the way the Scholar Progenium maintains its training. Each Inquisitor selects according to the Inquisitor's own assessment of what the Inquisition requires. The selected individual becomes the interrogator, the apprentice, the student, the being whose training the selecting Inquisitor directs across years or decades of shared investigation. The interrogator accompanies the Inquisitor on the investigations the Inquisitor conducts, learning the methods the experience provides, absorbing the knowledge the investigations produce, developing the judgment the Inquisition's purpose demands. The training is not standardized because the Inquisition's purpose is not standardized. The Inquisitor whose investigations focus on the daemonic trains the interrogator in the daemonic's detection and elimination. The Inquisitor whose investigations focus on the xenos trains the interrogator in the xenos' assessment and response. The Inquisitor whose investigations focus on the heretical trains the interrogator in the heresy's identification and address. Each interrogator's training reflects the selecting Inquisitor's specialization, and the specialization's diversity is the Inquisition's institutional character expressed through the training's individualized production. The interrogator becomes an Inquisitor through the selecting Inquisitor's endorsement. The elevation, the moment when the interrogator receives the inquisitorial rosette and the authority the rosette represents, is the selecting Inquisitor's declaration that the interrogator's training is complete, and that the interrogator's judgment is sufficient for the authority the elevation provides. The elevation is terrifying. The being who receives the rosette receives the authority to condemn worlds. The being who was an apprentice yesterday is today a being whose judgment can kill billions. The transition from the constrained to the unlimited is the most significant moment in any Imperial citizen's career. And the transition's magnitude is proportional to the authority's scope. The newly elevated Inquisitor begins the career the elevation has enabled, and the career's trajectory is determined by the Inquisitor's character as thoroughly as the trajectory is determined by the Inquisitor's training. The radical and the Puritan are the Inquisition's primary philosophical divide, and the divide's depth exceeds the divide's surface terminology. A Puritan is an Inquisitor whose methods conform to the Imperium's orthodox practices. The Puritan employs the weapons the Imperium provides. The Puritan follows the doctrines the Imperium prescribes. The Puritan maintains the boundaries the Imperium's governance establishes. The prohibition against the use of chaos-tainted artifacts. The restriction on the employment of xenos technology. The limitation on the methods the investigation's prosecution permits. A radical is an Inquisitor whose methods exceed the Imperium's orthodox practices. The radical employs the weapons the situation demands regardless of the weapon's provenance. The radical follows the doctrines the investigation's requirements prescribe regardless of the doctrine's orthodoxy. The radical crosses the boundaries the Imperium's governance establishes, because the radical's assessment determines that the boundary's maintenance would prevent the investigation's completion. The divide is not binary. The spectrum between the Puritan and the radical contains every shade the spectrum's range permits. The Inquisitors whose methods are mostly orthodox with occasional departures. The Inquisitors whose methods are mostly unorthodox with occasional conformities. The Inquisitors whose position on the spectrum shifts across the career's decades in response to the investigation's accumulated experiences. The divide's most significant implication is the divide's relationship with corruption. A radical Inquisitor whose methods include the employment of chaos-tainted artifacts or the utilization of demonic knowledge is an Inquisitor who is exposed to the corruption the method's subjects carry. The exposure does not guarantee the corruption. The exposure permits the corruption's possibility, and the possibility's realization is the risk the radical method's employment accept. The Puritan argues, the risk is unacceptable. The employment of the enemy's tools against the enemy produces the corruption the employment is designed to prevent. The Puritan fights chaos with the Emperor's weapons. The Puritan fights the xenos with the Imperium's technology. The Puritan maintains the boundaries, because the boundary's purpose is the prevention of the corruption the boundary's crossing produces. The radical argues, the risk is necessary. The enemy's tools are more effective against the enemy than the Emperor's weapons, because the enemy's tools are calibrated to the enemy's vulnerabilities. The radical employs the daemon host against the daemon. The radical uses the xenos artifact against the xenos. The radical crosses the boundaries because the crossing produces the results the boundary's maintenance prevents. Both arguments are valid. Both arguments produce results. Both arguments produce failures. The Puritan who refuses the radical methods fails when the orthodox methods are insufficient for the threat the investigation has revealed. The radical who employs the unorthodox methods fails when the employment produces the corruption the method's critics predicted. The failures define the careers. The Puritan who fails loses the investigation. The radical who fails loses the soul. The retinue is the Inquisitor's operational team. The collection of specialists, warriors, agents, and operatives whose capabilities supplement the Inquisitor's own, and whose contributions the investigation's prosecution requires. An Inquisitor's retinue is as individual as the Inquisitor. The composition reflects the Inquisitor's methods, the Inquisitor's specialization, the Inquisitor's personality. A Malleus Inquisitor's retinue might include daemon hosts, bound daemons whose power the Inquisitor directs against the threats the investigation reveals. A Xenos Inquisitor's retinue might include xenos technology specialists, or even, in the most radical cases, xenos individuals whose contributions the investigation's demands justify. A Hereticus Inquisitor's retinue typically includes the ecclesiastical, the priests, the penitents, the faithful whose conviction the investigation's heresy hunting purpose requires. The retinue might also include the violent, the assassins, the warriors, the beings whose combat capability provides the enforcement the investigation's conclusions demand. The retinue is not a military unit. The retinue is a conspiracy, a group of individuals whose loyalty to the Inquisitor exceeds the individual's loyalty to any other institution, whose service is personal rather than institutional, whose commitment is to the Inquisitor's purpose rather than to the Imperium's governance. The personal loyalty is the retinue's most significant quality and the retinue's most dangerous quality. The retinue whose loyalty to the Inquisitor is absolute is the retinue that will follow the Inquisitor into the methods the absolute loyalty permits, the radical methods, the boundary crossing, the unorthodox approaches whose employment the institutional loyalty would have prevented. Gregor Eisenhorn is the Inquisition's most famous individual, and the fame is the product of a career whose trajectory captures the Inquisition's character more precisely than any institutional analysis can produce. Eisenhorn began as a Puritan, the Ordo Xenos Inquisitor whose career commenced in the Scarus sector of the Segmentum Obscurus, started the career with the orthodox methods the Puritan position prescribed, the conventional investigations, the standard weapons, the boundaries the Imperium's governance established. Eisenhorn was effective. The Inquisitor, whose methods were orthodox, produced the results the orthodox methods generated. The results were insufficient. The threats Eisenhorn encountered across the career's decades exceeded what the orthodox methods could address. The chaos cults whose sophistication exceeded the standard investigation's capability, the Xenos threats whose complexity exceeded the conventional response's scope, the conspiracies whose depth exceeded what the Puritan method's surface-level investigation could reveal. Eisenhorn's methods evolved. The Puritan became the radical, not through a single decision, but through the accumulation of the decisions the investigation's demands produced. Each investigation pushed the boundary a fraction further. Each boundary crossing produced the result the crossing's risk had predicted would follow the crossing's success. Each success validated the crossing and made the next crossing's justification easier. The daemon host Cherubale is Eisenhorn's most significant boundary crossing. The bound daemon, the chaos entity whose power Eisenhorn directed against the threats the investigation encountered, was the radical method's most extreme expression. Eisenhorn employed a daemon against daemons. The employment was effective. The employment was also the crossing that the Inquisitor's peers classified as the crossing the Inquisitor could not return from. Eisenhorn was declared a heretic by Inquisitor Osma of the Ordo Malleus. The declaration was the Puritan institution's response to the radical Inquisitor's methods. The judgment that the boundaries crossing had exceeded the boundary the institution's tolerance could accommodate. Eisenhorn was exiled. The Inquisitor whose career had begun in the Orthodox became the Inquisitor whose career's conclusion was conducted in the heretical. Eisenhorn's trajectory is the Inquisition's trajectory compressed into a single career. The institution that begins with the Orthodox intention, the protection of humanity through the methods humanity's governance prescribes, evolves through the investigation's accumulated demands toward the methods the Orthodox cannot accommodate. The evolution is not the corruption's product. The evolution is the effectiveness's product. The result, the investigation's demands produce in the beings whose commitment to the investigation's success exceeds the being's commitment to the method's orthodoxy. Gideon Ravenor was Eisenhorn's student, the interrogator whose training under Eisenhorn produced the Inquisitor the training's quality deserved. Ravenor's career continued the themes Eisenhorn's career had established. The investigation of threats whose complexity exceeded the standard method's capability. The employment of methods whose orthodoxy the investigation's demands exceeded. Ravenor was confined to a force chair, the mobile life support platform the Inquisitor's injuries required after a catastrophic attack during the events on Thracian Primaris. The confinement transformed Ravenor's investigative methods. The Inquisitor whose physical capability the injuries had eliminated compensating through the psychic capability the Inquisitor's talent provided. Ravenor investigated through the mind rather than through the body. The psychic abilities providing the investigative tools the physical absence denied. Lord Inquisitor Fyodor Karamazov is the Puritan position's most extreme expression. The Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor whose intolerance exceeds every other Inquisitor's, whose judgment classifies every deviation from the orthodox as the heresy the deviation might become, travels the Imperium on a massive walking throne armed with multi-melters, dispensing the justice the Inquisitor's assessment prescribes with the zero tolerance the assessment's absolutism demands. Karamazov is effective. The worlds the Inquisitor visits are purged of heresy with the thoroughness the Inquisitor's methods provide. Karamazov is also terrifying. The Inquisitor whose methods do not distinguish between the genuinely heretical and the merely unusual, whose assessment's absolutism produces the condemnation of beings whose heresy is the interpretation's product rather than the behaviors. Karamazov represents the Puritan's worst case. The Inquisitor whose orthodoxy has exceeded the orthodoxy's purpose. The being whose commitment to the rules has surpassed the commitment to the values the rules were designed to serve. Karamazov does not protect the innocent. Karamazov protects the orthodox. The distinction between the two is the distinction Karamazov does not draw. Inquisitor Lord Torquemada Cotiaz is the Ordo Malleus's most prominent member and the Puritan position's most competent expression. Unlike Karamazov's blind zealotry, Cotiaz combines the Puritan's orthodox methods with the practical capability the daemon hunting mission demands. Cotiaz fights from the front, personally engaging the demonic entities the investigation reveals, leading the military response alongside the Grey Knights, whose chamber militant status the Ordo Malleus's authority provides. Coates's public profile exceeds most Inquisitors. Where the Inquisition's standard operational culture prescribes the secrecy the investigation's effectiveness requires, Coates operates openly. The Inquisitor Lord whose presence is visible, whose authority is displayed, whose commitment to the daemon hunting mission is conducted through the public medium rather than the shadowed. Inquisitor Cryptman of the Ordo Xenos is the Inquisitor whose decisions have affected more beings than any other Inquisitor in the institution's 10,000-year history. Cryptman's investigation of the Tyranid threat produced the assessment that the Hive Fleet's approach required the response the assessment prescribed: the exterminatus of entire worlds in the Hive Fleet's path, the destruction of the world's populations and resources to deny the Tyranids the biomass the consumption would have provided. The Cryptman Line, the corridor of destroyed worlds the Inquisitor's exterminatus orders produced, was the largest single application of the Inquisition's destructive authority in the institution's history. Dozens of worlds destroyed, billions of lives extinguished. The biomass the Tyranids would have consumed, eliminated through the method the Inquisitor's authority permitted, and the Inquisitor's judgment demanded. Cryptman was stripped of his rosette. The censure the other Inquisitors imposed, the judgment that the Cryptman Line's scale exceeded what the threat's severity warranted, was the institution's acknowledgement that the individual Inquisitor's authority, however broad, has limits the institution's collective judgment defines. Cryptman's censure demonstrates the Inquisition's self-policing mechanism. The institution that has no external oversight maintains the internal oversight the institution's own members provide. The policing is imperfect. The policing is also real. The Inquisitor who exceeds the authority's bounds faces the consequences the other Inquisitor's assessment imposes. Whether Cryptman was right, whether the worlds the Cryptman Line destroyed would have been consumed by the Tyranids, regardless of the exterminatus, and whether the exterminatus's preemption saved lives the consumption would have taken, is the question the Inquisition's internal debate has not resolved, and that the debate's participants' conflicting assessments suggest may not be resolvable. The question is the Inquisition's question in concentrated form. Does the threat's severity justify the response's cost? The Inquisition answers the question daily, across 1,000,000 worlds through the individual judgments the individual Inquisitors produce. The answers vary. The answer's variation is the Inquisition's institutional character, the absence of the standardized response the standardized institution would provide, replaced by the individual judgment the individual Inquisitor's authority permits. The individual judgment is the Inquisition's greatest asset and the Inquisition's greatest liability. The asset is the flexibility. The Inquisitor whose judgment is unconstrained can produce the response the situation's unique conditions demand. The liability is the same flexibility. The Inquisitor whose judgment is unconstrained can produce the response the Inquisitor's biases, the Inquisitor's fears, the Inquisitor's corruptions demand. The Inquisition contains both the effective Inquisitors whose judgments protect the Imperium, the failed Inquisitors whose judgments damage the Imperium. The institution that produces both does not distinguish between them through the institutional mechanisms the distinction would require. because the institutional mechanism's establishment would require the hierarchy the founding's principles prohibit. The Inquisition is the Imperium's most effective and most dangerous institution. The two are the same. The effectiveness produces the danger. The danger sustains the effectiveness. The circle has been turning for 10,000 years. The radical Puritan divide is the Inquisition's broadest philosophical classification, but the divide contains within it the sub-factions whose beliefs produce the Inquisition's most significant internal conflicts. The Amalathians are the Inquisition's conservative mainstream. The faction whose philosophy holds that the Imperium's current condition, however imperfect, however compromised, however distant from the ideal the Emperor's original purpose prescribed, is the condition the Emperor's will has produced, and that the Emperor's will therefore endorses. The Amalathians do not seek to change the Imperium. The Amalathians seek to maintain the Imperium, to preserve the existing institutions, to sustain the existing governance, to protect the status quo against the threats the status quo's disruption would produce. The Amalathian philosophy is the philosophy of the conservator. The Amalathian Inquisitor's investigations target the threats to the existing order, the heretics whose activities would disrupt the governance, the cults whose growth would destabilize the institutions, the conspiracies whose success would alter the balance the existing order maintains. The Amalathian does not investigate the order itself. The order is the assumed good. The threats to the order are the assumed evil. The investigation addresses the evil and preserves the good. Eisenhorn began as an Amalathian, the Inquisitor whose career's trajectory would carry him from the Puritan mainstream to the radical fringe, started in the faction whose philosophy prescribed the existing order's preservation. The trajectory's departure from the Amalathian position was the trajectory's most significant transition. The movement from the conservative philosophy that the existing order's preservation could address the threats the Inquisitor encountered to the pragmatic philosophy that the existing order's tools were insufficient for the threats the encounters revealed. The Thorians believe the Emperor will be reborn. The faction whose philosophy centers on the proposition that the Emperor's consciousness, trapped in the Golden Throne, sustained by the throne's machinery, diminished but not destroyed by the heresy's wounds, can be resurrected through the transfer of the Emperor's consciousness to a new physical vessel. The Thorians seek the vessel. The Thorians investigate the phenomena the vessel's identification might produce. The living saints, the miraculous manifestations, the psychic events whose quality suggests the Emperor's consciousness's engagement with the material universe. The Thorian philosophy is the philosophy of the resurrectionist. The Thorian Inquisitor's investigations target the phenomena the philosophy identifies as the Emperor's potential vessels, the individuals whose miraculous qualities suggest the Emperor's consciousness's involvement, the events whose psychic characteristics suggest the Emperor's will's expression. The investigations are hopeful. The hope is the philosophy's engine. The Xanthites are the Inquisition's most dangerous faction, and the danger is the faction's defining quality. The Xanthite philosophy holds that chaos, the warp's energy, the daemon's power, the corrupting influence the ruinous powers produce, can be harnessed, directed, employed against the enemies the harnessing produces the capability to address. The Xanthite does not simply employ the radical methods the radical position permits. The Xanthite employs chaos itself, the specific, deliberate, controlled use of the warp's power against the warp's servants. The Xanthite philosophy is the philosophy of the firefighter who uses fire. The Xanthite Inquisitor, whose investigations involve the chaos threat, employs the chaos tools, the daemon weapons, the warp-derived artifacts. The daemon hosts whose bound entities' power the Inquisitor directs against the threats the entity's unbinding would have produced. The employment is justified by the results. The results are produced by the employment. The circular justification is the Xanthite philosophy's vulnerability, and the vulnerability the philosophy's critics exploit. Eisenhorn's employment of the daemon host Cherubile was the Xanthite methodology applied through the practitioner's individual career. The Inquisitor, whose investigation required the capability the conventional methods could not produce, employed the daemon host. The bound daemon, whose power the Inquisitor directed against the threats the investigation encountered. The employment was effective. The employment was also the crossing that the Inquisitor's peers classified as the boundary the institution's tolerance could not accommodate. The Recongregators are the Inquisition's revolutionary faction. The philosophy holds that the Imperium's current condition is not the Emperor's will's product, but the Emperor's will's corruption. That the institutions the Imperium maintains have deviated from the Emperor's original purpose, and that the deviation's correction requires the institution's replacement rather than the institution's preservation. The Recongregator philosophy is the philosophy of the Reformer. The Recongregator Inquisitor's investigations target the institutions the philosophy identifies as the deviation's sources, the administratum's bureaucracy, the ecclesiarchy's theology, the governance structures whose functioning the philosophy assesses as the Emperor's purposes' corruption rather than the Emperor's purposes' fulfillment. The Recongregators are the Amalathians' opposite. Where the Amalathians preserve the existing order, the Recongregators seek the existing order's replacement. Where the Amalathians assume the order is the good, the Recongregators assume the order is the corruption. The two factions' conflicting assumptions produce the Inquisition's most fundamental internal divide. The disagreement about whether the Imperium the Inquisition protects is the Imperium the Emperor intended, or the Imperium the Emperor's absence has produced. The Monodominants are the Inquisition's most extreme Puritan faction. The philosophy holds that every non-human being and every heretical human being must be destroyed, without the nuance, without the assessment, without the case-by-case evaluation the other factions' philosophies prescribe. The Monodominants investigation does not evaluate the threat's magnitude. The Monodominants investigation confirms the threat's existence, and the confirmation produces the destruction the confirmation's consequence prescribes. Karamazov is the Monodominant philosophy's most visible practitioner. The Inquisitor Lord whose walking throne travels the Imperium dispensing the judgment the philosophy's absolutism demands is the philosophy expressed through the individual's career. The zero-tolerance assessment applied to every being the assessment encompasses. The destruction delivered to every being the assessment condemns. The faction's diversity is the Inquisition's institutional character expressed through the philosophical. The institution that has no hierarchy and no standardized doctrine produces the philosophical diversity the hierarchy's absence and the doctrine's absence permit. Each Inquisitor's philosophy is the Inquisitor's own, adopted through the career's experiences, refined through the investigation's accumulated evidence, maintained through the conviction the philosophy's validation produces. The diversity is the Inquisition's strength, and the Inquisition's weakness. The strength is the comprehensive response. The institution whose members' philosophies encompass every possible approach to the threats the institution addresses produces the comprehensive response the threat's diversity demands. The weakness is the internal conflict. The institution whose members' philosophies contradict each other produces the conflicts the contradictions generate. The conflicts are the institution. The institution is the conflict. The Inquisition's 10,000-year history is the history of the conflicts the philosophical diversity has produced, and the outcomes the conflict's resolution has generated. The conflicts have not destroyed the institution. The institution's survival across 10 millennia of internal conflict is the institution's most significant achievement. The demonstration that the institution's purpose survives the institution's internal disagreements, and that the purpose's persistence exceeds the disagreement's destructive potential. The purpose persists. The philosophies conflict. The Inquisition endures. The endurance is the purpose's victory over the conflict. The victory has been ongoing for 10,000 years. The planetary Governor's Day begins normally. The Governor's Day will not end normally. The Governor's world is unremarkable. An agri-world whose production feeds the surrounding subsector, whose population maintains the harvest the tithe demands, whose governance the Governor administers through the administratum's prescribed methods. The Governor is competent. The Governor is loyal. The Governor has served the Imperium's purpose across decades of administration, whose quality the administratum's assessors have rated as satisfactory. The Governor does not know the Inquisitor is here. The Inquisitor arrived 3 weeks ago. Not on the Governor's shuttle pad, not through the official channels the Governor's staff monitors, not with the announcement the Governor's protocol for distinguished visitors prescribes. The Inquisitor arrived as a merchant, a trader whose documentation the Planetary Customs Office processed without the attention the documentation's fabrication was designed to avoid attracting. The Inquisitor has been watching. For 3 weeks, the Inquisitor and the retinue specialists have been observing the Governor's world, the governance's operations, the population's behavior, the institution's functioning, the indicators the investigation's purpose is designed to identify. The investigation was triggered by a report. An acolyte's observation, the junior operative whose placement on the world predates the investigation by years, whose long-term monitoring the Inquisition's galaxy-spanning intelligence network maintains, identified an anomaly. The tithe's production numbers do not match the Governor's reports. The discrepancy is small, a fraction of a percentage, the kind of variance the administratum's assessors would classify as the rounding error the bureaucracy's imprecision produces. The Inquisitor does not believe in rounding errors. The discrepancy is the investigation's trigger. The discrepancy might be innocent, the production variation the natural conditions produce, the honest mistake the Governor's accounting staff have made. The discrepancy might be the surface expression of the corruption the surface does not reveal, the skimming, the diversion, the embezzlement whose product the discrepancy's measurement captures. The discrepancy might be something worse. The resources the discrepancy represents might be diverted to purposes the Imperium's governance does not sanction. The chaos cult whose supply the diverted resources sustain, the xenos collaboration whose commerce the diverted resources fund, the heretical activity whose prosecution the diverted resources enable. The Inquisitor investigates. The watching produces the assessment. The assessment produces the action. The governor receives the summons. The communication arrives through the channels the governor's staff monitors. The formal request for the governor's attendance at a meeting whose purpose the request does not specify, and whose requester's identity the request does not reveal. The governor attends. The Inquisitor presents the rosette. The governor's world stops. Not the planet continues its rotation. The governor's world, the internal world, the psychological landscape of assumptions and securities and certainties the governor's existence has maintained across decades of competent, loyal, satisfactory administration, stops. The rosette is the stopping's mechanism. The small, ornate device whose presentation is the declaration the governor's training has prepared the governor to recognize and to fear. An Inquisitor, on the governor's world, investigating the governor's governance. The fear arrives. The fear is the proper response, because the fear is the assessment of the situation the fear's subject has produced. The awareness that the being presenting the rosette has the authority to condemn the world the governor administers, and the power to execute the condemnation. The governor cooperates. The cooperation is the only response the rosette's presentation permits. The alternative, the refusal, is the defiance of the emperor's authority the rosette represents. And the defiance is heresy. And heresy's consequences exceed the cooperation's discomfort. The investigation proceeds. The Inquisitor's specialists examine the governor's records. The Inquisitor's psychers assess the governor's mind. Not the invasive telepathic interrogation the governor fears, but the surface-level empathic evaluation the psycher's passive monitoring provides. The Inquisitor's agents investigate the governor's staff, the governor's associates, the governor's household with the thoroughness the investigation's purpose demands. The governor waits. The waiting is the investigation's most torturous element for the investigation's subject. The uncertainty, the not knowing, the awareness that the investigation's conclusion might produce the acquittal or the condemnation, and that the distinction between the two is the Inquisitor's judgment, and that the judgment is forming, and that the judgment's formation is not shared with the judgment's subject. Days pass. The investigation continues. The governor administers the world. The administration is not normal. The awareness of the investigation's prosecution transforms the administration's character from the routine to the hyper-careful, every decision assessed through the lens of the investigation's potential evaluation. Every action weighed against the Inquisitor's possible interpretation. The investigation concludes. The Inquisitor summons the governor. The governor attends. The governor's fear is at its peak, the conclusion's revelation producing the uncertainty's maximum expression. The moment when the investigation's outcome will be declared and the declaration's content will determine the governor's fate. The Inquisitor speaks. The discrepancy was innocent. The production variance the natural conditions produced, compounded by the accounting error the governor's staff had introduced through the incompetence the error's nature revealed. The governor is not heretical. The governor is not corrupt. The governor is loyal. The governor is acquitted. The governor returns to the administration. The administration resumes. The world's routine restores itself around the disruption the investigation produced. The governor governs. The population works. The tithe is harvested. The governor does not sleep well for months. The investigation's trauma, the weeks of uncertainty, the fear of the condemnation the uncertainty contained, the awareness that the governor's life and the governor's world's existence were balanced on the Inquisitor's judgment, persists in the governor's psychology long after the investigation's conclusion has removed the investigation's cause. The governor is one of the fortunate. The governor was innocent. The governor was acquitted. The governor's world survives. Other governors are not fortunate. Other governors whose discrepancies are not innocent, whose investigations reveal the corruption the discrepancies concealed, whose governance has served purposes the Imperium's governance does not sanction, are not acquitted. The condemnation's consequences vary. The governor might be removed. The governor might be executed. The governor's world might be purged. The population processed. The governance restructured. The institutions reformed through the methods the Inquisitor's judgment prescribes. In the worst case, the governor's world is destroyed. The exterminatus, the condemnation's most extreme expression, the judgment that the world is beyond saving and that the world's destruction is the only response the threat's magnitude warrants. The governor whose governance has concealed the corruption the exterminatus addresses dies alongside the world the governance corrupted. The range of outcomes, from the acquittal to the exterminatus, from the governor's relief to the world's destruction, is the range the Inquisitor's individual judgment encompasses. The judgment is the variable. The authority is the constant. The constant's application to the variable produces the outcome the specific case generates. The outcome is just or the outcome is unjust. The justice or the injustice is determined by the judgment's accuracy, the Inquisitor's assessment's correspondence to the reality the assessment addresses. The accurate judgment produces the just outcome. The inaccurate judgment produces the unjust outcome. The Inquisition does not distinguish between the two in advance. The distinction is only visible in the aftermath, the outcome's evaluation by the beings whose perspective the outcome's consequences have produced. The governor who is justly acquitted and the governor who is unjustly condemned are distinguished only by the judgment's accuracy, and the accuracy is the Inquisitor's, and the Inquisitor is mortal, and the mortal is fallible. The fallible judges. The judgment falls. The galaxy trembles. Not because the judgment is always wrong. Because the judgment is sometimes wrong, and the sometimes is indistinguishable from the always, until the judgment's outcome reveals which the specific case contains. The fear is the rational response. The fear is the response to the awareness that the being whose judgment determines your fate is a mortal whose judgment might be wrong, and whose authority does not require the judgment to be right. The Inquisition does not apologize for the fear. The fear is the tool. The tool is effective. The effectiveness does not require the tool to be gentle. The Inquisitor arrives on your world, and your world changes. The arrival is not announced. The Inquisition does not send advance notice. The investigation's effectiveness depends on the investigation's subject's ignorance of the investigation's existence. The Inquisitor arrives quietly. The Inquisitor observes quietly. The Inquisitor begins the investigation before the investigation subjects know the investigation has begun. The first phase is the observation. The Inquisitor, accompanied by the retinue whose capabilities the investigation's requirements have assembled, observes the world's conditions, the governance, the population's behavior, the institution's functioning, the subtle indicators that the trained observer recognizes and that the untrained population produces without the production's awareness. A heresy cult does not announce itself. The cult's members do not wear the cult's symbols in the public spaces the Inquisitor's observation encompasses. The cult operates in the hidden, the basement meetings, the coded communications, the careful, deliberate concealment that the cult's survival in the Imperium's hostile environment demands. The Inquisitor must find what the cult has hidden, and the finding requires the methods the hiding sophistication demands. The methods are varied. The Inquisitor, whose investigation targets a heresy cult, might employ the infiltration, the placement of agents within the cult's membership, the retinue specialists adopting the identities the infiltration requires, the sustained, months-long penetration of the cult's organization that the infiltration's depth demands. The Inquisitor might employ the interrogation, the questioning of the cult's captured members, conducted through the methods the questioning's urgency prescribes, the methods ranging from the conversational to the surgical depending on the subject's resistance and the investigation's timeline. The Inquisitor might employ the psychic, the psychers whose capabilities the Inquisitor's retinue includes, the telepaths whose mind reading provides the intelligence that conventional methods cannot produce, the diviners whose precognition identifies the threats the conventional observation has not revealed, provide the investigative tools the Inquisitor's non-psychic methods cannot replicate. The investigation produces the assessment. The Inquisitor evaluates the evidence the investigation has gathered and produces the judgment the evaluation supports. The judgment's range encompasses every response the Inquisitor's authority permits, from the acquittal to the exterminatus. The judgments between the extremes are the judgments the Inquisitor most frequently produces. The cult is identified. The cult is eliminated through the military action the Inquisitor's authority commandeers, the Astra Militarum regiments or the Adepta Sororitas battle sisters, or the Space Marine kill teams whose deployment the Inquisitor's rosette compels. The governance is assessed. The governor whose complicity the investigation has revealed is removed. Through the political mechanisms the Inquisitor's authority provides, or through the more direct methods the Inquisitor's judgment prescribes. The aftermath is managed. The population whose world the investigation has disrupted is addressed. The memories modified if the investigation's content included information the population cannot be permitted to retain. The governance restructured if the investigation's findings require the restructuring. The military presence maintained if the investigation's assessment determines the presence's continuation is necessary. The Inquisitor departs. The world the Inquisitor leaves is not the world the Inquisitor arrived at. The investigation's prosecution has changed the world's conditions. The intervention's effects persisting long after the intervention's author has moved to the next investigation. The tools the Inquisitor employs are the most varied arsenal any individual in the Imperium commands. The Inquisitor can requisition military forces, any military force. The Inquisitorial Rosette's authority compels the cooperation of every military formation the Imperium maintains, the Astra Militarum's regiments, the Space Marine chapters, the Imperial Navy's vessels, the Titan Legion's god engines. The requisition is not a request. The requisition is a command whose authority derives from the Emperor's, and whose refusal is the refusal of the Emperor's authority. The requisition's scope is theoretically unlimited. An Inquisitor can requisition an entire battle fleet, An Inquisitor can commandeer a Space Marine chapter's forces. An Inquisitor can direct the Titan Legion's deployment. The theoretical scope is practically constrained by the institutional resistance the requisition produces. The military commanders whose forces the Inquisitor requisitions comply because the compliance is mandatory. But the compliance's quality reflects the commander's assessment of the requisition's justification. A Space Marine chapter master whose chapter an Inquisitor attempts to requisition complies with the political friction the compliance's implications generate. The chapter master's institutional pride resists the requisition's imposition. The chapter master's awareness of the Rosette's authority constrains the resistance's expression. The result is the grudging cooperation that the institutional pride and the institutional authority produce when the two interact. The Inquisitor employs agents. The acolytes, the junior operatives whose service the Inquisitor directs, the beings whose capabilities supplement the retinues, and whose numbers provide the coverage the investigation's scope demands. The acolytes are not Inquisitors. The acolytes are the Inquisitor's extensions. The eyes and the ears and the hands the Inquisitor deploys across the investigation's geography. The Inquisitor employs technology. The devices the Inquisition's armories maintain. The surveillance equipment. The communication systems. The weapons whose sophistication exceeds the standard military's issue provide the investigative and the enforcement capabilities the Inquisitor's methods require. The technology includes the forbidden, the artifacts whose provenance the Inquisition's radical members' methods have produced, the xenos devices whose capabilities exceed the Imperium standard technology, the chaos-tainted objects whose power the radical Inquisitor's judgment has determined can be directed against the chaos the objects originate from. The Inquisitor employs fear. The most effective tool the Inquisitor carries is not the Rosette or the weapons or the technology or the military forces the Rosette commands. The most effective tool is the fear, the knowledge, distributed across the Imperium's population through the rumors and the stories and the disappearances the Inquisition's operations produce. That the Inquisition exists, and that the Inquisition's attention is the worst thing that can happen to any being whose behavior attracts it. The fear produces the compliance the investigation requires before the investigation begins. The governor who knows the Inquisition exists governs differently than the governor who does not. The awareness of the Inquisition's potential attention constraining the governor's behavior in ways the Inquisition's actual attention would enforce. The fear is the Inquisition's most efficient tool, because the fear operates continuously across every world the Imperium contains. Without the Inquisition's physical presence, the fear's effect would otherwise require. The fear is also the Inquisition's most damaging tool. The population that fears the Inquisition is the population whose behavior is constrained by the fear rather than by the loyalty the Imperium's governance should produce. The fear-driven compliance is not the loyalty-driven compliance. The distinction between the two is the distinction between the slave's obedience and the citizen's commitment. And the distinction's implications for the Imperium's long-term stability are the implications the Inquisition's critics identify, and that the Inquisition's defenders dismiss. The dismissal is the Inquisition's institutional response to every criticism the institution receives. The critics are wrong because the critics do not understand the threats the Inquisition addresses. The criticism is naive because the criticism does not account for the conditions the Inquisition's methods are designed to manage. The alternatives the critics propose are insufficient. because the alternatives do not produce the results the Inquisition's methods generate. The dismissal is sometimes correct. The critics are sometimes wrong. The threats are sometimes as severe as the Inquisition claims. And the methods are sometimes as necessary as the Inquisition's defenders assert. The dismissal is also sometimes the institution's refusal to examine the institution's own failures, the defensive response that power produces when power's exercise is questioned by the beings power's exercise affects. The Inquisition does not distinguish between the two. The institution whose authority is unlimited does not accept the distinction's validity, because the distinction's acceptance would require the humility the unlimited authority does not produce. What does an Inquisitor experience? The question is rarely asked because the Inquisition's subjects, the beings whose worlds the Inquisitor investigates, whose governance the Inquisitor evaluates, whose lives the Inquisitor's judgment affects, are preoccupied with their own experience of the Inquisitor's arrival. The subject's terror, the subject's compliance, the subject's relief or condemnation, the subject's experience consumes the attention the question's asking would require. The Inquisitor's experience deserves examination because the experience reveals the institution's character through the individual's lens. An Inquisitor is alone. Not physically, the retinue provides the companionship the physical isolation would otherwise produce. Institutionally, the Inquisitor whose authority exceeds every other being's on every world the Inquisitor visits is the being whose peers are absent from every world the Inquisitor visits. The Inquisitor interacts with inferiors. The Inquisitor commands subordinates. The Inquisitor engages with subjects whose compliance the authority compels. The Inquisitor does not engage with equals. The Inquisitor's equals, the other Inquisitors whose authority matches the Inquisitor's own, are distributed across the galaxy's volume, conducting their own investigations on their own worlds, separated from the Inquisitor by the distances the galaxy's scale imposes. The Inquisitor who needs the counsel of an equal, who needs the perspective that only a being of equivalent authority and equivalent experience can provide, must seek the equal across the distances the seeking requires. The loneliness produces the insularity. The Inquisitor whose interactions are exclusively with inferiors develops the perspective the exclusively inferior interactions produce. The assumption that the Inquisitor's judgment is correct because the Inquisitor's judgment is unchallenged. The confidence that the Inquisitor's assessment is accurate because the assessment has not been subjected to the peer review the peer's absence prevents. The insularity produces the error. The Inquisitor whose judgment has not been challenged by an equal is the Inquisitor whose errors have not been identified by the being whose capability the identification requires. The errors accumulate. The errors compound. The errors produce the outcomes the error's nature generates, the incorrect investigations, the unjust condemnations. The flawed judgments whose flaws the insularity has prevented the identification of. The loneliness also produces the determination. The Inquisitor who carries the authority alone, who bears the responsibility for the judgments the authority permits without the institutional support the responsibility's weight should produce, develops the determination the solitary bearing demands. The determination sustains the career. The determination carries the Inquisitor through the investigations the career encompasses, the decades of the threat's identification, the conspiracy's unraveling, the heretic's condemnation. The determination is the Inquisitor's most admirable and most dangerous quality. The admirable determination produces the effective investigation. The Inquisitor whose commitment to the investigation's purpose exceeds the obstacles the investigation encounters. The dangerous determination produces the obsessive investigation. The Inquisitor whose commitment to the investigation's conclusion exceeds the evidence the investigation has produced. The obsession is the career's occupational hazard. The Inquisitor whose investigations span decades, whose career's accumulated evidence produces the patterns the evidence's volume reveals, develops the obsession the pattern recognition generates. The pattern is real, or the pattern is imagined. The obsession does not distinguish between the two, because the obsession is the pattern's pursuit, and the pursuit does not pause for the verification the distinction requires. The obsessed Inquisitor is the Inquisition's most dangerous product, the being whose authority is unlimited and whose judgment is obsessive, produces the outcomes the combination generates. The investigations pursued past the evidence's support, the condemnations delivered past the judgment's justification, the worlds destroyed past the destruction's warrant. Not every Inquisitor becomes obsessed. The claim's negation is important because the claim's universal application would produce the conclusion the institution's critics desire. The conclusion that the Inquisition is universally flawed and that the institution's universal flaw warrants the institution's elimination. The conclusion is wrong. Many Inquisitors maintain the judgment's balance across decades of effective investigation. Many Inquisitors produce the correct assessments, and the just condemnations, and the warranted interventions the institution's purpose prescribes. The many do not eliminate the some. The some Inquisitors whose judgment has been compromised by the loneliness, by the insularity, by the obsession, by the corruption the investigation's subjects carry and that the investigation's prosecution can transmit, produce the outcomes the compromised judgment generates. The outcomes are the institution's failures. The failures are real. The Inquisitor carries the weight. Every Inquisitor, the effective and the compromised, the just and the obsessive, carries the weight the authority imposes. The weight is the awareness. The awareness that the judgment the Inquisitor produces affects lives the Inquisitor's errors cannot restore. The awareness that the condemnation the Inquisitor delivers is final. The condemned do not appeal. The destroyed do not recover. The dead do not return. The weight produces the response the weight's nature demands. Some Inquisitors respond with the humility the weight's magnitude prescribes. The careful, deliberate, evidence-driven investigation whose prosecution reflects the awareness that the judgment's consequences exceed the judgment's reversibility. Some Inquisitors respond with the hardening the weight's sustained carrying generates. The callous, efficient, outcome-driven investigation whose prosecution reflects the awareness that the judgment's consequences cannot be permitted to slow the judgment's delivery. The humble Inquisitor is the effective Inquisitor. The hardened Inquisitor is the dangerous Inquisitor. The institution contains both, and the institution does not distinguish between them through the mechanisms the distinction would require. The Inquisitor serves the Emperor. The service's purpose is the Imperium's protection. The protection's prosecution is the investigation's conduct. The investigation's conduct is the judgment's formation. The judgment's formation is the Inquisitor's, the mortal being whose authority is the Emperor's but whose mind is the mortal's. The mind carries the weight. The mind produces the judgment. The judgment determines the world's fate. Every Inquisitor carries this. every day. For decades, for centuries, if the Inquisitor's rejuvenate treatments sustain the body across the centuries the career encompasses, the carrying is the service. The service is the sacrifice. The sacrifice is the Inquisitor's contribution to the Imperium the sacrifice serves. The sacrifice is not acknowledged. The Inquisition does not receive the Imperium's gratitude. The institution whose service is conducted in the shadows does not receive the recognition the service's quality would warrant if the service were conducted in the light. The Inquisitor who saves a world through the investigation's prosecution does not receive the world's thanks, because the world does not know the investigation occurred. The Inquisitor who destroys a world through the exterminatus receives the galaxy's condemnation, the horror the destruction produces in the beings, whose awareness of the destruction's visibility permits. The destruction is visible. The saving is invisible. The Inquisitor whose service encompasses both the saving and the destroying is perceived through the destroying rather than through the saving, because the destroying is the act the perception can access. The Inquisitor does not seek the perception's correction. The Inquisitor serves. The serving does not require the gratitude. The serving requires the judgment. The judgment requires the authority. The authority requires the rosette. The rosette gleams. The judgment forms. The authority acts. The Inquisitor serves. The serving is the purpose. The purpose does not end. The chamber militants are the Inquisition's military fists, and each fist is forged for a different enemy. The Grey Knights serve the Ordo Malleus. The demon-hunting Space Marine chapter, the secret chapter, chapter 666. The warriors whose gene seed derives from the Emperor himself provides the Malleus Inquisitors with the anti-demonic military capability the daemon threat's elimination requires. The relationship between the Malleus Inquisitor and the Grey Knight's strike force is the Inquisition's most practiced military partnership. The intelligence the Inquisitor provides directing the strike force the Grey Knights deploy. The investigation and the elimination conducted as the coordinated operation the partnership's millennia of practice have refined. The Death Watch serves the Ordo Xenos. The kill teams, the multi-chapter formations whose members are drawn from chapters across the Imperium, seconded to the Death Watch's service, equipped with the specialized weapons the Xenos threat's diversity demands, provide the Xenos Inquisitors with the tactical versatility the Xenos threat's variety requires. A Death Watch kill team is a surgical instrument, not the blunt force the conventional Space Marine deployment represents. The company's strength formation whose firepower overwhelms the enemy through the force's volume. The kill team is precise. 5 or 6 Space Marines, selected for the qualities the mission's requirements demand, equipped with the weapons the specific Xenos target's vulnerabilities prescribe, deployed through the methods the mission's stealth or the mission's urgency requires. The kill team's composition reflects the target. A kill team deployed against a tyrannid organism includes the Marines whose experience with tyrannid biology provides the knowledge the engagement's prosecution requires. A kill team deployed against an Orc warboss includes the Marines whose combat capability exceeds the warboss's, the individual Marine's selection calibrated to the individual target's characteristics. The Adeptus Sororitas serves the Ordo Hereticus, the Sisters of Battle, the warrior women of the Ecclesiarchy, the faithful whose combat capability is sustained by the faith the combat expresses, provide the Hereticus Inquisitors with the military, force the internal threats elimination demands. The partnership between the Hereticus Inquisitor and the Sororitas is the Inquisition's most theologically charged relationship. The Inquisitor, whose investigation targets the heresy, and the sisters whose faith the heresy offends, fighting the heresy's manifestation through the combined institutional response. The Chamber militant's existence gives the individual Inquisitor access to military capabilities that exceed what any other individual in the Imperium commands. An Inquisitor who presents the rosette to a Grey Knight strike cruiser's commander, or to a Death Watch captain, or to a canoness of the Adepta Sororitas, is an Inquisitor who is accessing the most specialized military formations the Imperium maintains, the forces whose training and whose equipment address the threats the Inquisitor's investigation has revealed. The access is the authority expressed through the military. The Inquisitor's unlimited authority includes the unlimited access to the military capability the authority's enforcement requires. The Inquisitor who needs the Grey Knights to banish a daemon has the Grey Knights. The Inquisitor who needs the Death Watch to eliminate a xenos infiltration has the Death Watch. The Inquisitor who needs the Sisters of Battle to purge a heresy has the Sisters. The having is the power. The power is the Inquisition. The common Imperial citizen does not know the Inquisition exists. The statement requires qualification. The common citizen knows the word. The Inquisition's existence is not entirely concealed from the Imperium's population, the rumors, the stories, the cultural references that the institution's 10,000-year operation has produced in the populations the operation encompasses are present in the Imperium's collective awareness. The common citizen has heard of the Inquisition. The common citizen does not know what the Inquisition is. The rumors are vague. The stories are exaggerated. The cultural references are the myths the institution's operational secrecy has produced. In the population, the secrecy excludes from the institution's reality. The common citizen imagines the Inquisition as the boogeyman, the dark authority whose agents descend from above to punish the wicked, the institutional expression of the Emperor's wrath directed at the beings whose wickedness the wrath addresses. The imagination is simultaneously correct and insufficient. The Inquisition is the authority that descends to address the wicked. The Inquisition is also the authority that descends to address the investigation's requirements, regardless of the requirement's relationship to the wickedness the imagination identifies. An Inquisitor whose investigation requires the commandeering of a civilian facility, the factory whose production the investigation's evidence suggests is connected to the threat the investigation pursues, commandeers the facility without the explanation the civilian's understanding would require, because the explanation would compromise the investigation the explanation addresses. The civilian whose factory is commandeered does not understand. The civilian knows only that beings of terrible authority have seized the civilian's property, and that the seizure's purpose is not explained, and that the seizure's justification is the rosette the terrible beings present. The civilian complies. The civilian fears. The civilian does not know why. The not knowing is the common citizen's relationship with the Inquisition. The citizen who encounters the institution encounters the authority without the context, the power without the explanation, the action without the justification, the consequence without the reasoning. The citizen's experience of the Inquisition is the experience of the inexplicable, The authority that arrives, acts, and departs without the transparency the authorities exercise in a just governance would require. The Inquisition is not a just governance. The Inquisition is an effective governance. The distinction between the two is the distinction the Imperium's conditions have made necessary, and that the Imperium's citizens experience without the vocabulary the distinction's articulation requires. The citizens comply. The citizens fear. The citizens do not understand. The not understanding is the Inquisition's operational condition expressed through the citizens' experience. The Inquisition's agents are everywhere. The acolytes, the junior operatives, the extended network of the Inquisitor's eyes and ears, are embedded in the Imperium's population across every world the Inquisition's operational scope encompasses. The agent who works alongside the citizen in the manufactoria may be an acolyte. The merchant who trades in the citizen's market may be an observer. The priest who conducts the services the citizen attends may be reporting to the Inquisitor, whose investigation the priest's reporting serves. The penetration is comprehensive. The Inquisition's network, the accumulated product of 10,000 years of agent placement and network development, encompasses every significant population center the Imperium contains. The network is not omniscient. The network has gaps, the worlds the network's placement has not reached. The populations the network's agents have not penetrated, the corners of the Imperium the Inquisition's attention has not encompassed. The gaps are the threat's hiding places, the corruption that the network has not detected, the heresy the agents have not identified, the conspiracy the Inquisition's attention has not reached. These are the threats the gaps contain, and that the gap's closure through the network's continuous expansion is designed to address. The network expands. The agents are placed. The observations accumulate. The intelligence flows from the periphery to the Inquisitors whose investigations the intelligence serves. The flow is the institution's circulatory system. The information moving from the galaxy's edges to the Inquisitor's assessments. The assessments producing the judgments the assessments support. The judgments producing the actions the Imperium's protection demands. The circulatory system is the Inquisition's most significant institutional achievement. Not the authority. The authority was provided by the founding. Not the capability was provided by the chamber militants. The network, the galaxy-spanning web of observers and agents and operatives whose collective output provides the intelligence the institution's purpose requires. The network sees. The network reports. The Inquisitor acts. The acting is the Inquisition's purpose fulfilled through the network's medium. The medium has been functioning for 10,000 years. The functioning continues. The exterminatus is the Inquisition's most terrible authority, and the authority's exercise is the Inquisition's most terrible act. The word means extermination. The word's application means the destruction of a world's biosphere, the elimination of every living thing the world's surface contains, the reduction of a habitable planet to a dead rock through the methods the Imperial Navy's arsenal provides. The methods vary. Virus bombing, the dispersal of the life-eater virus across the world's atmosphere. The biological agent consuming every organic compound the atmosphere contains. The world's biosphere dissolved into the chemical slurry the virus's metabolic output produces. The slurry is then ignited. The gases the decomposition generates combusted through a single orbital strike. The firestorm consuming the atmosphere the virus has poisoned. The world's surface sterilized by the combination of the biological and the thermal. Cyclonic torpedoes, the nuclear devices whose yield exceeds what the standard military arsenal contains, the warheads designed for the purpose the standard warheads yield cannot address. The torpedo's detonation produces the seismic disruption the world's geological integrity cannot sustain. The crust fracturing, the mantle breaching, the world's surface reduced to the molten ruin the torpedo's geological effects generate. Atmospheric incinerators, the orbital weapons whose thermal output exceeds the world's atmosphere's capacity to dissipate. The heat accumulating in the atmosphere until the atmosphere's temperature exceeds what the biosphere's organisms can sustain. The world burns. Not the firestorm the virus bombing produces, the slow, sustained, planet-wide heating that eliminates the biosphere through the thermal conditions the heating generates. Each method produces the same outcome. The world dies. The billions of beings the world's surface contained, the human population whose existence the Imperium's governance was supposed to protect, die alongside the world. The death is total. The death is irreversible. The death is the Inquisitor's judgment, expressed through the most destructive medium the Imperium's arsenal provides. The justification is the assessment. The Inquisitor whose investigation has concluded that the world's corruption exceeds what the remediation's methods can address. The demonic incursion whose scope has contaminated the population beyond the purging's capacity. The genestealer cult whose infiltration has reached the planetary governance's level. The chaos corruption whose depth has compromised the world's institutional integrity past the restoration's capability. Produces the assessment that the exterminatus is the response the threat's magnitude demands. The assessment is the Inquisitor's, not a committee's, not a governance council's. The individual Inquisitor's judgment that the world's continued existence represents a threat to the Imperium that exceeds the world's continued existence's value. The judgment balances the world's population against the threat's propagation. The billions who will die against the billions the threat's unchecked growth would eventually consume. The mathematics are cold. The billions who die in the exterminatus are the cost the threat's elimination demands. The billions the threat's elimination saves are the benefit the cost produces. The cost-benefit analysis is the Inquisitor's, the mortal being whose judgment the arithmetic's accuracy depends on, and whose arithmetic's error produces the outcome the error's magnitude generates. The error's outcome is a dead world whose death was not warranted. The Inquisitor who orders an exterminatus based on the incorrect assessment. The investigation whose conclusions the subsequent analysis reveals were wrong. The judgment whose foundation the subsequent evidence undermines, has killed a world without cause. The killing is irreversible. The world does not return. The billions do not resurrect. The Inquisitor who has ordered the justified exterminatus carries the weight. The correct judgment that the world's destruction was warranted does not eliminate the weight the destruction produces in the being who ordered the destruction. A billion deaths, even the deaths the necessity demands, produce the weight the billion's magnitude generates in the consciousness the billion's ordering occupies. Some Inquisitors carry the weight with the stoicism the weight's bearing requires. The weight is the duty's cost. The cost is accepted because the duty is accepted, and the duty's acceptance includes the cost's acceptance. Some Inquisitors carry the weight with the damage the weight's bearing produces. The Inquisitor who has ordered the exterminatus, who has killed a world, who has signed the death warrants of billions through the single act the authority permits, carries the killing in the consciousness the killing's magnitude has marked. The marking does not heal. The marking persists. Alongside the markings, the subsequent exterminatus orders produce, if the career's conditions require the subsequent order's issuance. Some inquisitors carry the weight with the hardening the weight's repeated bearing generates. The inquisitor, who has ordered multiple exterminatus actions, whose career's conditions have required the repeated destruction of worlds whose corruption the investigations have revealed, develops the callousness the repetition produces. The first exterminatus is devastating. The second is difficult. The third is procedural. The subsequent are the routine the repetition's normalization produces. The normalization is the Inquisition's most dangerous institutional phenomenon. The being whose authority includes the destruction of worlds and whose career has normalized the destruction's exercise is the being whose judgment the normalization has compromised. The Inquisitor for whom the exterminatus has become routine is the Inquisitor whose assessment of the exterminatus's justification is no longer conducted with the rigor the assessment's consequence demands. The normalization produces the unjustified exterminatus. The Inquisitor whose career has normalized the destruction orders the destruction when the destruction is not warranted. The assessment's rigor degraded by the normalization's effect. The judgment's accuracy compromised by the judgment's routine exercise. Cryptman's case is the normalization's most extreme expression. The Inquisitor whose career produced the Cryptman line, the corridor of destroyed worlds the Inquisitor's exterminatus orders created to deny the Tyranids the biomass the Tyranids' advance would have consumed, is the Inquisitor whose normalization exceeded the institution's tolerance. Cryptman's orders destroyed dozens of worlds. The destruction's scale produced the censure the other Inquisitor's assessment demanded. Whether Cryptman's normalization exceeded the justified is the question the censure's aftermath has not resolved. The worlds the Cryptman line destroyed would have been consumed by the Tyranids. The populations the exterminatus killed would have died in the consumption. The Cryptman line may have saved more lives than the line's destruction consumed. The Tyranids' denial of the biomass slowing the Hive fleet's advance and providing the time the Imperium's defense required. The mathematics are disputed. The mathematics dispute is the Inquisition's condition expressed through the arithmetic's medium. The institution whose authority permits the destruction of worlds cannot determine whether the destruction's exercise is justified without the determination's criteria being contested by the beings whose criteria differ from the determining inquisitors. The exterminatus is the Inquisition's ultimate authority and the Inquisition's ultimate responsibility. The authority to destroy worlds is the responsibility to justify the destruction. The responsibility's fulfillment depends on the judgment. The judgment depends on the judge. The judge is mortal, the worlds are permanent. The destruction is irreversible. The Inquisitor orders. The navy complies, the world dies, the weight is carried. Or the weight is normalized, or the weight is dismissed. The Inquisition does not monitor which response the individual Inquisitor produces. The monitoring would require the oversight the institution's founding principles prohibit. The principles are the institution. The institution is the principles. The worlds die within the principles' scope. The Inquisition has fought wars, not the Imperium's wars. The Inquisition participates in the Imperium's wars when the Inquisition's purpose intersects the war's prosecution. The Inquisition's own wars, the conflicts the Inquisition has prosecuted through the Inquisition's authority, directed at the threats the Inquisition's investigations have revealed, conducted through the methods the Inquisition's unlimited authority permits. The Months of Shame is the Inquisition's most controversial war, and the controversy reveals the institution's character with the precision the controversy's content provides. The First War for Armageddon, the demonic invasion led by the daemon Primarch Angron, was the engagement that produced the controversy. The Grey Knights deployed to Armageddon, banished Angron, and saved the world. The saving's aftermath produced the crisis. The Inquisition determined that the witnesses had to be addressed. The Imperial Guard regiments and the civilian populations who had witnessed the demonic incursion, who had seen Angron, who had seen the Grey Knights, who carried the knowledge of daemons the Inquisition's secrecy protocols demanded be suppressed, were targeted for elimination. Inquisitor Lord Gesme Kisnaros directed the operation. The Order Malleus Inquisitor, whose authority encompassed the Armageddon engagement's aftermath, ordered the Guard regiment's execution and the civilian population's processing, the mind-wiping, the relocation, the elimination of the knowledge the secrecy's maintenance demanded. The Space Wolves refused. Logan Grimnar, the Great Wolf, the chapter master whose warriors had fought alongside the Guard regiments the Inquisition was targeting, would not permit the killing. The refusal was absolute. The refusal was backed by the Space Wolves' full military capability. The refusal produced the war. The Inquisition, supported by the Grey Knights, engaged the Space Wolves. Loyalist fought loyalist. The Inquisition's unlimited authority confronted the Space Marine chapter's martial capability. And the confrontation produced the violence the confrontation's participants' institutional pride demanded. The Months of Shame, the Grey Knight's name for the conflict, lasted long enough to produce casualties on both sides, and to demonstrate the truth the conflict's occurrence revealed. The Inquisition's authority is unlimited, but the Inquisition's power is not. The being whose rosette compels compliance can compel the compliance of the willing. The being whose rosette confronts the unwilling discovers that the rosette's authority and the rosette's enforcement are different things, and the enforcement's failure is the authority's limitation. Grimnar killed Kisnaros. The Great Wolf's axe ended the Inquisitor Lord's life during the conflict's most significant engagement. The killing the demonstration that the Inquisitor's authority does not protect the Inquisitor from the acts of the being who rejects the authority. The conflict ended through negotiation. The populations were not eliminated. The populations were relocated, sterilized, subjected to the measures the compromise the Space Wolves' resistance had demanded produced. The outcome was the Inquisition's first significant institutional defeat, the first occasion on which the Inquisition's unlimited authority was successfully challenged by a force whose martial capability exceeded the Inquisition's enforcement. The defeat's implications were managed through the Inquisition's institutional culture. The Months of Shame became the Months of Shame, the classified, compartmentalist, institutionally suppressed record of the occasion when the Inquisition's authority was proven insufficient against the Space Wolves' resistance. The defeat's lessons were absorbed. The defeat's recurrence was planned against. The War of the Beast was the crisis that produced the Ordo Xenos. In the 32nd millennium, the Orc warlord known as the Beast, the most powerful Orc the galaxy had produced since the species' creation, launched an invasion whose scale exceeded anything the Imperium had faced since the heresy. The Beast's forces reached Terra. The Imperium's capital was threatened by the Greenskin Horde. The Inquisition's response to the Beast's invasion was the Inquisition's most significant strategic contribution to the Imperium's military history. The inquisitorial representative to the High Lords, the Inquisitor whose position on the ruling council provided the institution's political voice, directed the Imperium's response alongside the other High Lords. The Inquisition's intelligence, the information the institution's galaxy-spanning network had gathered about the Beast's forces and the Beast's capabilities, provided the strategic assessment the response's planning required. The Beast was eventually defeated. The defeat's cost was immense. The Imperium's military forces depleted. The Imperial Fist's chapter destroyed. The political landscape of the Imperium's governance permanently altered. The Inquisition's assessment of the defeat's lessons produced the Ordo Xenos. The institutional response to the Xenos' threat, the Beast's invasion, had demonstrated the existing structure could not adequately address. The age of apostasy was the crisis that produced the Ordo Hereticus. In the 36th millennium, Goj Vandai's reign of blood demonstrated that the Imperium's own governance could produce threats exceeding the external threats the existing Ordos addressed. The Ordo Hereticus's creation was the Inquisition's response to the lesson the Reign of Blood had taught. The lesson that the Imperium's internal institutions could be corrupted, and that the corruption's detection and elimination required the dedicated institutional response the Ordo Hereticus provided. The Inquisition fights itself. The statement is not the metaphorical observation about the radical Puritan divide's philosophical conflict. The Inquisition literally fights itself. Inquisitor against Inquisitor, retinue against retinue. The institution's members engaging in the armed conflict, the philosophical differences, and the personal rivalries the institution's culture produces. Inquisitorial wars, the formal designation for the conflicts between inquisitors whose investigations have produced contradictory conclusions, or whose methods have produced institutional conflict, are the Inquisition's most destructive institutional events. An inquisitor whose investigation has concluded that a threat exists, and an inquisitor whose investigation has concluded that the threat does not exist, can produce the conflict the contradictory conclusions generate. Each inquisitor's authority equal, each inquisitor's judgment claiming the emperor's endorsement, each inquisitor's conviction producing the determination the conflict sustains. The inquisitorial conclave is the mechanism the institution employs to resolve the conflicts the individual authority produces. A conclave is a gathering of inquisitors, the assembly whose collective judgment addresses the disputes the individual judgments have produced. The conclave hears the disputant's arguments, evaluates the evidence the disputants present, and produces the resolution the collective judgment supports. The resolution is not binding. The inquisitor whose position the conclave rejects can ignore the conclave's resolution, because the individual inquisitor's authority is not subordinate to the conclave's collective judgment. The ignoring produces the consequences the ignoring's defiance generates, the other inquisitor's censure, the institutional isolation the defiance produces, the potential for the armed conflict the defiance's continuation might demand. The Inquisition's internal conflicts are the institution's most significant vulnerability. The institution whose authority is unlimited and whose hierarchy is absent produces the conditions the internal conflict thrives in. The competing authorities, the contradictory judgments, the personal rivalries that the unconstrained authority permits. and that the absent hierarchy cannot resolve. The internal conflicts consume resources. The Inquisitors who fight each other are not fighting the Imperium's enemies. The retinues whose weapons are directed at other Inquisitors' retinues are not directing the weapons at the heretics and the daemons and the xenos the weapons were intended to address. The internal conflict's cost is measured in the investigations the conflicts prevent and the threats the prevention permits. The Inquisition's defenders argue that the internal conflicts are the institution's quality control, the mechanism through which the institution identifies and eliminates the members whose methods or whose judgments have exceeded the institution's tolerance. The conflicts are the policing. The policing is necessary. The policing's cost is the price the institution pays for the absence of the hierarchy the policing replaces. The argument is defensible. The argument is also the justification the powerful produce. When the powerful's internal conflicts are questioned by the beings the conflict's consequences affect. The Inquisition contains both the justification and the question. The institution that polices the Imperium cannot police itself without the policing producing the conflicts the policing is supposed to prevent. The circle turns. The circle has been turning for 10,000 years. The Inquisition's relationship with the Imperium's other institutions is the relationship of power to the being's power is exercised over, and the relationship's character varies across the institutions the relationship encompasses. The Adeptus Custodes regard the Inquisition with the measured assessment the custodians bring to every Imperial institution. The custodians recognize the Inquisition's purpose. The custodians do not defer to the Inquisition's authority, the custodian's own authority, derived from the Emperor directly, exceeds the Inquisition's. The relationship is one of parallel authorities, the custodians protecting the Emperor's person, the Inquisitors protecting the Emperor's Imperium, the two purposes complementary, but the two authorities independent. The Space Marine chapters regard the Inquisition with the wariness that independent military forces bring to the observation of the political authority whose reach extends into the military's domain. A chapter master whose chapter an Inquisitor investigates experiences the investigation as the intrusion the investigation's authority permits but that the chapter master's institutional pride resents. The chapters cooperate because the cooperation is mandatory. The cooperation is not warm. The Astra Militarum regards the Inquisition with fear. The mortal soldiers whose service the Inquisitor can commandeer, whose lives the Inquisitor's investigation can consume, whose memories the Inquisitor's secrecy protocols can erase, whose existence the Inquisitor's judgment can terminate. Regard the Inquisition with the terror that unlimited authority produces in the beings the authority is unlimited over. The ecclesiarchy regards the Inquisition with the hostility that parallel power structures produce when the structures' domains overlap. The ecclesiarchy's authority over the Imperium's faith and the Inquisition's authority over the Imperium's orthodoxy produce the jurisdictional conflicts the overlapping domains generate. The Ordo Hereticus, whose investigation of heresy encompasses the ecclesiarchy's own governance, is the ecclesiarchy's most unwelcome institutional partner. The Mechanicus regards the Inquisition with the caution that the technologically dependent bring to the observation of the politically powerful. The Mechanicus provides the Inquisition with the technology the investigation requires. The Mechanicus does not provide the technology willingly when the technology's provision includes the Mechanicus's own secrets. The relationships are the power's radiating effects. The Inquisition's unlimited authority touches every institution the Imperium contains. And the touching produces the responses the touching's nature generates. The fear, the resentment, the cooperation, the resistance, the institutional friction that unlimited authority produces in the institutions the authority encompasses. The era Indomitus has tested the Inquisition in ways the previous 10 millennia did not produce, and the testing is revealing the institution's limitations alongside the institution's strengths. The Great Rift has divided the Inquisition the way the Rift has divided everything else. The Inquisitors operating in the Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy, severed from the Astronomican's light, are operating without the institutional support the Inquisition's galaxy-spanning network previously provided. The communications are disrupted. The intelligence is fragmented. The conclaves that resolve the internal disputes cannot gather across the Rift's barrier. The Inquisitors in the Nihilus are alone. Not the operational solitude the Inquisitors' standard working conditions produce, the independence the investigation's prosecution permits. The institutional solitude, the separation from the network the individual Inquisitor's effectiveness depends on. The isolation from the resources the network provides. The Inquisitor in the Nihilus operates without the intelligence the Inquisitors in the Sanctus generate, without the military requisitions the Sanctus's chain of command provides, without the institutional mechanisms the Inquisition's internal governance maintains. The isolation has produced the radicalism. The Inquisitors whose isolation has removed the institutional constraints the Inquisition's collective judgment provides are the Inquisitors whose methods have expanded past the boundaries the collective judgment maintained. The radical methods that the pre-Rift Inquisition managed through the Conclave's oversight are unchecked in the Nihilus. The Inquisitors whose judgment determines the method's employment operating without the peers, whose judgment would have constrained the employment. The Rift has also produced the opportunity, the threats the Rift generates, the demonic incursions, the chaos cult proliferation, the institutional collapse the Rift's disruption produces in the Imperium's governance, are the threats the Inquisition was designed to address. The Inquisitors whose investigations target these threats are producing the results the investigation's prosecution generates, the cults identified, the incursions contained, the governance restored through the methods the Inquisitor's authority permits. The opportunity and the isolation are the same condition viewed from different angles. The Inquisitor whose isolation has removed the institutional constraints is also the Inquisitor whose isolation has provided the freedom the threats addressing demands. The freedom produces the effective response. The freedom produces the unchecked excess. The two are the same freedom's different products. Guilliman's return has complicated the Inquisition's institutional position. The Lord Regent, the returned Primarch whose authority as the Imperium's ruler exceeds every other living being's, has expressed opinions about the Inquisition's methods that the Inquisition's institutional culture does not easily accommodate. Guilliman regards the Inquisition as necessary. The Primarch whose pragmatism encompasses the assessment of every imperial institution recognizes the Inquisition's contribution to the Imperium's survival, the threats identified, the conspiracies revealed, the corruptions addressed through the methods the Inquisition's authority permits. The questioning has not produced the reform. The Inquisition's independence is embedded too deeply in the institution's foundational authority for the reform the questioning implies to be implemented, without the implementation producing the institutional conflict the Inquisition's capabilities would make devastating. Guilliman has not attempted the reform. The Primarch, whose political intelligence exceeds most beings, recognizes that the attempt's cost would exceed the attempt's benefit. The Inquisition continues, unchanged by the Primarch's return, unchanged by the Rift's disruption, unchanged by the 10,000 years of the Imperium's evolution that have transformed every other institution the Imperium contains. The Inquisition does not change because the Inquisition was designed not to change. The Founding's principles, the independence, the unlimited authority, the absence of hierarchy, are the principles the institution has maintained across 10 millennia of conditions that the principles' immutability has survived. The principles are the institution. The institution is the principles. The change would be the institution's replacement with something the institution is not. The Inquisition is what the Inquisition has always been. The question is whether what the Inquisition has always been is what the Imperium currently needs. The Inquisition is the 41st millennium's most important question about the relationship between power and accountability. Expressed through the institutional medium the question's subject provides. The question is this: can unlimited power serve the good? The Inquisition's history provides both the affirmative and the negative answer simultaneously. The Inquisitors, whose unlimited authority has been employed in the Imperium's defense. The investigations that have identified and eliminated genuine threats. The interventions that have prevented the catastrophes the threats would have produced. The judgments whose correctness the outcomes have confirmed demonstrate that unlimited power can serve the good when the power's holder's judgment is sound. The Inquisitors, whose unlimited authority has been employed against the Imperium's interests, the investigations that have condemned the innocent, the interventions that have produced the suffering the interventions were supposed to prevent, the judgments whose incorrectness the outcomes have revealed, demonstrate that unlimited power cannot serve the good when the power's holder's judgment is flawed. The good depends on the judgment. The judgment depends on the judge. The judge is a mortal being whose judgment is subject to the biases, the fears, the corruptions, and the limitations that every mortal being's judgment contains. The Inquisition's unlimited authority is wielded by beings whose judgment is limited. The unlimited wielded by the limited is the Inquisition's foundational contradiction, and the contradiction has been producing its consequences for 10,000 years. The consequences include the world saved. The Inquisitors whose investigations have identified the genuine threats, the chaos cults whose growth the investigation's intervention prevented from reaching the critical mass the growth's continuation would have produced. The xenos infiltrations whose elimination the investigation's prosecution achieved. The heretical movements whose suppression the investigation's judgment demanded have saved worlds, saved populations, saved the Imperium from the threats the Imperium's other institutions did not detect and could not address. The consequences also include the worlds destroyed. The Inquisitors whose investigations have produced the wrong judgments, the exterminatus orders whose justification the subsequent assessment has questioned, the populations eliminated whose heresy the subsequent investigation has not confirmed, the innocents condemned whose innocence the condemning Inquisitor's judgment did not perceive, have destroyed worlds, destroyed populations, destroyed the beings the Inquisition was founded to protect. The Inquisition saves and the Inquisition destroys. And the distinction between the saving and the destroying is the distinction the individual Inquisitor's judgment produces. And the judgment is mortal, and the mortal is fallible, and the fallible is the condition the unlimited authority does not accommodate. The Inquisition is the Imperium's necessary evil. The phrase captures the institution's character with the precision the phrase's components provide. Necessary. The Imperium cannot survive without the Inquisition's contribution, because the threats the Inquisition addresses are threats no other institution can address. Evil. The methods the Inquisition employs produce the suffering the method's employment generates. And the suffering is real regardless of the suffering's justification. The necessary and the evil are inseparable. The Inquisition cannot be necessary without being evil, because the necessity's fulfillment requires the methods the evil describes. The Inquisition cannot be evil without being necessary, because the evil's justification is the necessity the evil serves. The Imperium needs the Inquisition. The Imperium fears the Inquisition. The needing and the fearing are the same relationship expressed through different emotional registers. The Inquisitor walks through the Imperium's corridors. The rosette gleams. The authority radiates. The beings the Inquisitor passes respond. The compliance, the fear, the deference that the unlimited authority produces in the beings the authority encompasses. The Inquisitor investigates. The Inquisitor judges. The Inquisitor acts. The acting saves or the acting destroys. The distinction depends on the judgment. The judgment depends on the judge. The judge is mortal. The authority is not. The gap between the mortal and the authority is the Inquisition's condition. The gap has existed since the founding. The gap will exist until the Emperor rises from the Golden Throne and provides the accountability the founding deliberately omitted. The Emperor does not rise. The gap persists. The Inquisition operates within the gap, the mortal beings wielding the immortal authority. The limited judgment directing the unlimited power, the fallible producing the consequences the infallible would not. 10,000 years. The Inquisition has been operating in the gap for 10,000 years. The institution's history is the gap's history. The consequences the mortal authority has produced across the millennia, the gap encompasses. The world's saved and the world's destroyed and the beings protected and the beings condemned by the judgments the gap's mortal inhabitants have generated. The gap does not close. The Inquisition does not change. The authority does not diminish. The judgment does not improve. The consequences continue. Somewhere in the Imperium, an Inquisitor is arriving on a world. The rosette is concealed. The investigation is beginning. The subjects do not know they are subjects. The methods are being selected. The judgment is forming. The judgment will save or the judgment will destroy. The world the Inquisitor has arrived at will be different when the Inquisitor departs, protected or condemned, preserved or eliminated. The distinction determined by the mortal being whose authority exceeds the mortals but whose judgment does not. The Inquisitor investigates. The Inquisitor finds. The Inquisitor judges. The judgment falls. The world responds. Somewhere in the Imperium, another Inquisitor is arriving on another world. The rosette is concealed. The investigation is beginning. The cycle continues. The cycle has been continuing for 10,000 years. The cycle will continue for as long as the Imperium exists, and the threats the Inquisition addresses persist, and the authority the founding provided remains in force. Nobody is above suspicion. Nobody is beyond investigation. The Inquisition watches. The Inquisition judges. The Inquisition acts. And the galaxy trembles. Because the galaxy knows. The galaxy has known for 10,000 years that the most powerful force in the Imperium is not the Space Marines or the Titan Legions or the Imperial Navy's battle fleets. The most powerful force in the Imperium is a single being with a rosette and a judgment and the authority to act on both. The Inquisition endures. The watching continues. The judgment falls.